On the western edge of Cleveland, there's a stretch of land the city insists was always empty. Official maps label it undeveloped. Planning records describe it as open ground. But buried beneath layers of asphalt and soil, construction crews once uncovered brick foundations arranged in perfect residential rows, along with a rusted street sign bearing a name that does not appear in any surviving municipal blueprint: Maple Grove Avenue. Utility ledgers reference sewer lines that shouldn't exist there. Census totals hint at residents who have no recorded addresses. The question isn't what was built there, it's why the city says it never was. During the economic strain of the Great Depression, cities across the United States quietly restructured land, redrew zoning lines, and consolidated struggling districts to stabilize collapsing tax revenues. In parts of Cleveland, these adjustments were routine, administrative decisions buried in council minutes and planning revisions. But one West Side tract stands apart. Early fire insurance maps and utility ledgers suggest a narrow residential lane once stood there, complete with connected sewer lines and taxed structures. A handful of church and school records reference families living on a street called Maple Grove Avenue. Yet within a few years, official planning maps reclassified the same land as non-platted and undeveloped. No demolition permits appear. No disaster reports explain a clearance. The transformation wasn't dramatic, it was bureaucratic. And when the paperwork settled, the neighborhood had vanished not only from the ground, but from the legal memory of the city itself. Long before it became an empty designation on planning maps, Maple Grove Avenue occupied a narrow strip of land on the western edge of Cleveland. It branched off near what is now West 65th Street, positioned between modest industrial corridors and expanding residential blocks that were steadily pushing outward from the city's core. The land was not picturesque, but it was practical, level enough for foundations, close enough to factories for working families, and distant enough from downtown congestion to feel stable. The homes themselves were modest duplexes and single-family frame houses, constructed during a period of post-war housing demand. Building materials were simple: red brick facades on some structures, wood siding on others, shallow front porches supported by square columns. The street was unpaved, a packed dirt lane that turned muddy after heavy rain, but hardened in dry weather. Residents described it as quiet in later recollections, not wealthy, not neglected, simply functional. Sanborn fire insurance maps from the late 1920s show a thin rectangular roadway labeled Maple Grove Avenue, lined with evenly spaced structures. Those maps were created for risk assessment, not storytelling, which makes their precision notable. Each building footprint is carefully drawn, indicating occupancy and construction type. The layout suggests intentional development, not an informal cluster of shacks. Someone planned this street. Utility ledgers from the period add weight to that conclusion. Sewer connections are documented along that corridor. Water service lines are marked as active. Electrical permits were issued for residential installations. These are not the records of vacant farmland. They are the records of a functioning neighborhood integrated into city infrastructure. Maple Grove's residents were largely first- and second-generation immigrants, many working in steel mills along the Cuyahoga River or in manufacturing plants that fueled Cleveland's industrial economy. The street's location allowed for a manageable commute on foot or by streetcar. Church records from a nearby Catholic parish reference baptisms and marriages tied to Maple Grove addresses, suggesting a stable community rather than a transient encampment. Children walked to parish school together. Grocers extended credit during lean weeks. Porch conversations carried across narrow yards. The architecture did not announce prosperity, but it reflected permanence. Small flower beds lined some walkways. Fences separated properties in tidy rectangles. Even the drainage ditch running alongside the block had been reinforced in places with stone to prevent erosion. Maps from adjacent years show incremental expansion of surrounding streets, evidence that this part of Cleveland was not abandoned or forgotten. It was growing. And Maple Grove sat directly within that growth pattern, neither isolated nor temporary. Yet something subtle appears in later planning documents. While neighboring streets are labeled clearly and incorporated into updated zoning districts, Maple Grove's designation begins to blur. In certain revisions, the street name is faint or absent. Lot numbers once assigned to specific parcels are consolidated under broader tract descriptions. The physical place did not disappear overnight. Houses do not dissolve silently. But on paper, the block's identity began to weaken. What makes Chapter 1 unsettling is not that Maple Grove was unusual, it was ordinary. That ordinariness is precisely what makes its erasure difficult to explain. This was not a remote rural settlement or an improvised encampment beyond city limits. It lay within Cleveland's mapped expansion zone, connected to utilities, referenced in tax rolls, and acknowledged in church registries. The place existed in brick and timber, in sewer lines and school attendance logs. It occupied measurable space. It housed working families. It followed the rhythms of industrial America in the early 20th century. And yet, within a decade, official documentation would treat that same stretch of land as if it had never held a street at all. If Maple Grove Avenue existed physically, the paper trail should confirm it. Cities are meticulous record keepers. Property changes, utility installations, census counts, and tax payments all leave impressions in ink. Streets are not simply built, they are registered, assessed, coded, and archived. But when researchers began tracing Maple Grove through Cuyahoga County archives, the documentation did something unusual. It thinned out. Property tax rolls from the late 1920s list parcel numbers corresponding to a narrow west side tract near Cleveland. Several entries include notations such as residential frame or two-family dwelling, each attached to assessed values consistent with modest working-class homes. The parcels are numbered sequentially, implying subdivision planning. Yet in updated rolls from just a few years later, those same parcel numbers are either consolidated into a single tract or marked with annotations such as void, reclassified, or simply left blank. Tax records are rarely poetic. They do not speculate, they calculate. So when an assessed property disappears without notation of demolition, foreclosure sale, or transfer to a new owner, it creates a procedural anomaly. The census introduces further irregularities. District population summaries from the early 1930s reflect more residents than surviving street listings can account for. Enumeration districts were designed to be comprehensive. Enumerators walked block by block, listing every household. Yet when the microfilm copies of those sheets are examined, several page numbers within the district sequence are missing. The gap is small, just enough to represent a single short street. Whether those pages were lost, damaged, or never preserved is unclear. Archival loss is not uncommon, but the missing sequence aligns precisely with the corridor where Maple Grove once appeared. Planning records provide another clue. In earlier infrastructure diagrams, sewer and water connections extend into the Maple Grove tract. Later revisions show those lines terminating earlier than previously drawn, as though the block beyond them had never required service. Engineering maps are technical documents, and alterations are typically dated and signed. In this case, some revisions appear without marginal explanation. Then there is the matter of plat approval. In municipal governance, a subdivision becomes legally recognized when a plat map detailing lot boundaries, street widths, and easements is formally approved and recorded. Without that approval, streets can exist physically but lack legal standing. They are built spaces without administrative acknowledgement. Planning board minutes from the late 1920s reference a proposed West Side subdivision with a similar layout to Maple Grove. However, final approval language is absent from subsequent entries. Instead, later minutes discuss non-platted development requiring compliance review. That phrase suggests something critical. Maple Grove may have been constructed before final legal recognition was granted. If so, its existence depended on paperwork that was never completed. By the mid-1930s, zoning maps reclassify the area as undeveloped tract. There is no detailed demolition report attached to the change. No condemnation order appears in indexed case files. Instead, the land's designation shifts categories from subdivided residential parcels to a single undivided block. Bureaucratically, this kind of shift can occur when tax delinquency leads to municipal reclamation. During the Great Depression, cities faced widespread defaults. Foreclosed parcels were often bundled and reclassified to simplify administration. In such cases, individual lot histories could vanish into aggregated descriptions. The records do not shout, they withdraw. And in that withdrawal, a neighborhood slips from legal existence without a formal goodbye. A neighborhood becomes real through its people. Streets can be redrawn and parcels reclassified, but families leave impressions that paper rarely erases cleanly. In the case of Maple Grove Avenue on the west side of Cleveland, one family's fragmented record offers a glimpse into what that vanished street once meant. The Kovacs family appears repeatedly in parish ledgers from a nearby Catholic church. Their surname is written in careful cursive beside baptism entries, confirmation lists, and small donation acknowledgments. Next to their names, an address is recorded: Maple Grove Avenue. The entries span several years, suggesting stability rather than temporary lodging. And then, the address changes. Later entries list only West District in the address field. No street name, no house number, just a broader, less precise designation. The family remains present in the church record, but the geography attached to them becomes indistinct. City directories from the same period add texture to their story. Early listings show a head of household employed at a steel mill along the Cuyahoga River, his occupation noted simply as roller. The address corresponds to Maple Grove Avenue. In subsequent editions, his name appears again, same occupation, same employer, but the address field is blank for 1 year and replaced by a different West Side street the next. The shift is abrupt. School enrollment records provide another fragment. 2 children bearing the Kovacs surname were enrolled at a parish school within walking distance of Maple Grove. Midway through a term, both names are marked withdrawn. No explanation is written in the margin, no transfer destination is recorded. Families relocate for many reasons: employment, foreclosure, opportunity. But when an entire block's worth of families appear to shift in similar patterns within a narrow window of time, it becomes harder to frame as coincidence. Utility service ledgers preserved in municipal archives indicate clustered termination dates for water and gas connections along the Maple Grove corridor. Rather than a gradual decline, the shutoffs occur within weeks of each other. Such synchronization suggests coordinated vacancy rather than staggered moves. The Kovacs family's tax status offers further insight. Property rolls from the early 1930s list their parcel with a modest assessed value. In a subsequent revision, the parcel number tied to their lot is marked delinquent. In the next available roll, that number no longer appears individually. It has been absorbed into a larger tract designation. What happened between those entries is not spelled out. There is no eviction notice preserved in court archives under their name, no foreclosure sale advertisement in the local newspaper, no recorded lawsuit disputing ownership. Instead, the paper trail narrows. Church attendance continues, but addresses blur. Employment listings persist, but geographic anchors dissolve. School records showed departure without documented arrival elsewhere. Oral history collected decades later from elderly West Side residents includes vague references to a block that cleared out fast during the Depression. One interviewee described neighbors packing belongings into borrowed trucks. Another recalled hearing that tax arrears and zoning complications made the street unofficial. No one described violence. No one mentioned forced removal by police. The memory conveyed something quieter, a sense that families were told their homes no longer met requirements or that ownership status had shifted in ways they could not contest. For immigrant families like the Kovacs, navigating municipal legal structures during economic collapse would have been daunting. If their subdivision lacked finalized plat approval, their deeds may have carried vulnerabilities not immediately visible. A bureaucratic reclassification could render their street non-compliant, their parcels invalid, their addresses obsolete. The Kovacs name survives in scattered documents, but Maple Grove does not. Their children grew up somewhere else. Their work continued in Cleveland's mills. Their parish life adapted to a new address. But the place that once defined their daily routine, the porch, the unpaved road, the neighbors within arm's reach, faded from official existence. Through one family's shifting address fields and silent withdrawals, we see the human dimension of administrative erasure. The disappearance of Maple Grove was not abstract. It unfolded in schoolrooms, in parish registries, in tax ledgers bearing real surnames. When the street vanished from maps, it did not vanish from memory immediately. It vanished from documentation first. When a neighborhood burns, newspapers report smoke. When a flood sweeps through streets, photographs follow. When a court orders eviction, legal notices leave ink behind. But the disappearance of Maple Grove Avenue on the west side of Cleveland produced none of those signals. There is no headline announcing clearance, no archive of demolition permits stamped and signed, no public health bulletin condemning unsafe housing. Instead, there is quiet. Local newspapers from the period were thorough in covering civic disruption. Industrial strikes, factory layoffs, infrastructure expansions, all were reported in detail. Entire columns tracked municipal adjustments during the economic crisis. Yet within those pages, there is no reference to a residential block being removed or displaced in that corridor. Silence in journalism can mean many things. Sometimes it signals that nothing dramatic occurred. But when layered against tax roll irregularities, census gaps, and sudden utility terminations, the absence begins to feel less neutral. City council minutes from the early 1930s discuss zoning compliance, tax delinquency rates, and land consolidation strategies. The language is technical, almost antiseptic. Phrases like parcel aggregation and reclassification for fiscal stability appear repeatedly. There are references to non-plotted subdivisions requiring review. There are discussions of revenue shortfalls and the need to streamline administrative oversight. But Maple Grove Avenue is never named directly. This is where the silence becomes structured rather than accidental. Bureaucracies do not always narrate their decisions in human terms. A street does not need to be mentioned if it has already been categorized as an irregularity. Once absorbed into a broader tract, its name becomes redundant within official documentation. In planning revisions from the mid-1930s, the land where Maple Grove once appeared is labeled simply as undeveloped property. The previous grid of lot lines dissolves into a blank block on updated maps. What had been multiple parcels is rendered as a single shape. No explanation is attached to the transformation. The infrastructure records follow the same pattern. Earlier diagrams show sewer connections extending into the Maple Grove corridor. Later maps truncate those lines. Engineering annotations do not specify removal, they simply omit continuation. The effect is subtle. Nothing declares that something ended. Instead, records cease referencing it. Oral accounts collected decades later suggest that residents were aware of uncertainty before they left. Some remembered rumors that their subdivision lacked formal approval. Others described notices about tax arrears posted at homes. But these memories lack official confirmation. They exist only in recollection. The silence also appears in the legal system. Court archives from that period contain foreclosure proceedings and property disputes across Cleveland. Names are indexed, case numbers are preserved, yet no consolidated record of Maple Grove foreclosures appears under a shared designation. If properties were reclaimed, the process did not leave a singular trace under the street's name. Silence can function as camouflage. By processing each parcel individually, rather than acknowledging a collective displacement, administrative action avoids narrative cohesion. There is no single moment to point to, no ordinance that reads, "Maple Grove Avenue is hereby dissolved." Instead, the silence spreads across categories: planning, taxation, infrastructure, journalism. Each archive holds a fragment of absence. What remains is the pattern. Families disappear from a street listing. Utility services end in close succession. Parcel numbers merge. Maps erase labels. No document contradicts another directly. They simply stop aligning with earlier versions. The absence of scandal does not guarantee the absence of impact. A neighborhood can be erased without confrontation if its legal standing is weak enough. During economic crisis, administrative efficiency can overshadow preservation. In Maple Grove's case, the silence feels deliberate not because it shouts secrecy, but because it's consistent. Every institutional voice lowers itself at once. And when every archive falls quiet together, what remains is not noise, but erasure without echo. For decades, the land where Maple Grove Avenue once appeared remained visually unremarkable, a flat stretch absorbed into the expanding infrastructure of the west side of Cleveland. Asphalt covered most of it. A portion was graded into municipal utility space. To anyone passing through, it looked like transitional land awaiting future development. Then excavation began. A routine road expansion project required deeper grading than previous resurfacing work. Construction crews cut through layers of compacted soil and broken stone, descending below the modern roadway base. Within days, machinery struck something solid, not bedrock, but structured resistance. What emerged first were rectangular brick outlines beneath the soil, aligned in parallel formation. The patterns were too uniform to be accidental. Each footprint suggested the perimeter of a basement foundation. Mortar lines remained visible. In some areas, sections of wall still stood several courses high, preserved by decades of compression above them. City engineers were called to document the find before excavation continued. The foundations were spaced evenly, consistent with residential lot divisions. Between them ran a strip of compacted gravel that appeared to have once formed a narrow roadway. Embedded within that strip were fragments of ceramic drainage pipe and rusted metal fittings, typical of early 20th century plumbing systems. These were not agricultural remnants, they were the bones of houses. Further excavation uncovered sections of cast iron water pipe branching toward what would have been individual properties. The pipes were capped, not shattered, suggesting deliberate disconnection rather than catastrophic destruction. In one location, workers found remnants of tiled flooring, pale hexagonal pieces commonly used in modest kitchens of the era. Then came the object that shifted the narrative. Near what appeared to be the center of the former roadway, partially corroded but still legible, lay a metal street marker. Stamped into its face were the words Maple Grove Ave. The name matched references found in earlier parish registries and preliminary maps, the very name absent from modern city documentation. Engineers photographed the sign and cataloged its dimensions. It was not improvised. Its lettering style aligned with municipal street markers used in Cleveland during the 1920s. The mounting holes suggested it had once been affixed to a post at a street corner. If the city had manufactured and installed a street sign, the street had achieved some level of official acknowledgement, even if temporary. Yet in current planning archives, Maple Grove Avenue did not appear as a historical designation. The discovery triggered internal review but no public announcement. From an engineering standpoint, the foundations were considered obsolete structures predating modern development. Once documented, most of the exposed remnants were removed to allow construction to proceed. No preservation order was issued. No historical marker was installed. The physical evidence briefly contradicted the administrative record, then disappeared beneath fresh asphalt. What makes the discovery significant is not just that houses once stood there, it is that their arrangement corresponded precisely with earlier map references that had since been revised. The excavation validated that Maple Grove was not a cartographic error or an oral exaggeration. It had been a constructed environment with infrastructure, utilities, and defined lots. And yet, even with foundations visible in the open air, the legal classification of the land did not change. In municipal databases, the tract remained categorized as previously designated, undeveloped prior to mid-century redevelopment. Physical proof surfaced, but administrative identity held. The moment was brief, a few weeks of exposed brick and rusted pipe before progress reclaimed the ground. Workers moved on to pour new concrete, to level the surface, to extend the road. Underneath that smooth stretch now lie the outlines of kitchens and living rooms, the path of a street once walked daily by residents whose names survive only in scattered records. Discovery did not restore Maple Grove to the map. It simply confirmed that something real had once stood where official memory insists there was nothing.
The word cover-up suggests secrecy in dark rooms, whispered agreements, and hidden files locked away from scrutiny. But what happened to Maple Grove Avenue on the west side of Cleveland appears to have been quieter than that, less dramatic, more procedural. If there was concealment, it lived in process, not conspiracy. During the economic collapse of the early 1930s, municipalities across the country were overwhelmed. Tax delinquency rates climbed sharply, homeowners defaulted, cities struggled to maintain services while revenue shrank. In response, many local governments streamlined land administration, consolidating parcels and reclassifying problematic subdivisions to stabilize their books. In that context, a small, possibly non-platted street like Maple Grove would have posed a bureaucratic inconvenience. If the original developer failed to secure final plat approval, the street may have existed in a gray zone, physically built, partially serviced, but not fully integrated into the city's permanent legal framework. That distinction matters. Without finalized plat status, lot lines can be invalidated, street names can be withheld from official registries, property descriptions can revert to larger tract identifiers. In such cases, when taxes go unpaid or ownership becomes unclear, municipalities may reclaim parcels individually through foreclosure proceedings. Those parcels are then aggregated under a broader municipal holding designation. What looks like disappearance can, in administrative terms, be consolidation. Tax rolls from the period show precisely that pattern. Individual Maple Grove parcel numbers vanish from later books and are replaced by a single consolidated tract reference. The language attached to the change is neutral, reclassified, absorbed, non-compliant subdivision. There is no ordinance dissolving the street, there is no public hearing transcript debating its fate. Instead, the paperwork shifts categories. This kind of bureaucratic erasure requires no malicious intent. It relies on hierarchy. When legal recognition depends on recorded plat maps, anything outside that system becomes vulnerable. A street sign can be installed, homes can be taxed, utilities can be connected. But without finalized recorded approval, the development rests on unstable legal ground. During economic crisis, unstable ground rarely receives protection.
City council minutes from the era reference land rationalization and revenue protection through tract simplification. Those phrases sound abstract, but their practical effect can be profound. Simplification reduces administrative complexity. It also reduces the visibility of what once existed. If Maple Grove properties fell delinquent in clusters, perhaps as factory work fluctuated, municipal foreclosure could have occurred quietly, parcel by parcel. Once reclaimed, the lots would no longer require street designation. The city could collapse them into a single municipal holding, eliminating the need to maintain separate records. Over time, the absence reinforces itself. Later planners reviewing maps would see only a consolidated tract. Without earlier plats on file, they would assume the land had always been unplatted. When infrastructure diagrams were updated, lines extending into the old corridor might be trimmed to reflect current classification. No one would need to actively delete Maple Grove. It would simply fail to be carried forward. The 1970s excavation that uncovered foundations and a street marker did not trigger historical revision because administratively there was nothing to revise. The official position already described the land as undeveloped prior to mid-century infrastructure projects. Physical remnants were interpreted as remnants of temporary or irregular construction, not as evidence contradicting formal records. This is how bureaucratic cover-ups differ from criminal ones. They do not rely on secrecy so much as on technical legitimacy. Every step can be justified within regulatory frameworks. Every reclassification can cite compliance standards. Every omission can be attributed to incomplete documentation. Yet the outcome remains the same. A street name disappears from maps. Parcel numbers dissolve into tract codes. Families' addresses lose specificity. No single document announces that Maple Grove was erased. Instead, the system protects its internal consistency. And in protecting that consistency, it leaves behind foundations beneath asphalt, physical proof that administrative memory is not the same as lived reality.
What happened to Maple Grove Avenue on the west side of Cleveland is not a story of fire or flood, nor one of violence or spectacle. It is a story about the fragile relationship between lived experience and legal recognition. A neighborhood can stand in brick and timber, echo with children's footsteps, and still depend entirely on paperwork to secure its place in history. The families who lived on Maple Grove did not consider themselves temporary. They paid taxes, they attended church, they sent their children to school. They worked in the mills and factories that powered Cleveland's economy. Their lives were anchored to a street name printed on envelopes and written carefully into parish registries. In daily practice, their neighborhood was as real as any other. But permanence, it turns out, is an administrative privilege. When economic pressure tightened during the Great Depression, municipalities across the country prioritized survival. Budgets contracted, delinquent properties multiplied. Legal technicalities that once seemed minor, incomplete plats, irregular lot filings, unresolved developer obligations, became vulnerabilities. Streets that lacked perfect documentation were easier to absorb than to defend. Maple Grove appears to have fallen into that category, not through scandal, but through classification. This is the unsettling lesson. History is not erased only by force, it can be dissolved by procedure. When parcel numbers are consolidated, they lose individuality. When addresses are voided, memory loses coordinates. When a street name fails to appear on an updated map, the next generation assumes it never existed. Each step seems rational within its own bureaucratic logic. Together, they reshape reality. The excavation decades later briefly disrupted that logic. Brick foundations emerged, sewer lines reappeared beneath layers of asphalt. A metal street sign bearing the name Maple Grove Avenue surfaced as quiet testimony. For a moment, the physical world contradicted the administrative one. But the contradiction did not last. Once documented, the foundations were removed, construction resumed, and the land returned to its officially defined state. The archives remained unchanged. No historical marker was installed. No revision to planning maps restored the street's name. The system remained internally consistent. What makes this reflection difficult is that no villain stands clearly in view. There is no documented order declaring the street erased, no evidence of malicious intent. Instead, there is a chain of practical decisions shaped by economic stress and regulatory structure. Yet the absence of overt wrongdoing does not erase the human impact. Families were displaced, whether by foreclosure, compliance review, or financial collapse. Their street identity disappeared. The place that framed their routines slipped out of civic acknowledgement. Over time, even memory thinned as generations passed. The land itself still holds the outline of what was built there. Beneath modern pavement lie the negative spaces of kitchens and basements, the paths of water lines once carrying daily life into homes. Physical traces persist longer than administrative ones. Maple Grove's story reminds us that archives are curated, not neutral. They reflect the priorities of those who maintain them. What is carefully recorded gains permanence. What falls outside formal recognition risks fading. We often trust maps as objective representations of reality, but maps are agreements. They show what institutions decide to show. When a street disappears from a map, it does not mean it never existed. It means it no longer fits within the system that draws boundaries. In the end, Maple Grove Avenue forces a question larger than its modest size. How many other places have slipped quietly from official memory because they failed to meet technical standards at the wrong moment in history? Not every disappearance is dramatic. Some are administrative, and those may be the most difficult to recover. Some histories aren't destroyed, they're simply rewritten. If you find stories like this compelling, places that exist beneath official memory, consider subscribing. There are more forgotten maps to unfold.